Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first week of DFAM. My name is Aracelia Aguilar, and I'm one of Deaf Hope's Empowerment Directors. Hello, everybody. I'm thrilled you could join us today. I'm Brian Berlinski, and I'm one of Deaf Hope's Empowerment Directors. Okay, great. So before we continue with our presentation, a couple of things that I would like to recognize first. I do want to make an acknowledgement and provide a trigger warning. The first acknowledgement is that we're currently occupying Ohlone Indian land by white settler colonialists, and it's important to recognize that we are not here by accident. We need to acknowledge the history, the system of violence, and how we have benefited from those systems, and recognizing our power and privilege during today's event and in our personal lives here forward. Yesterday was a special day. It was Wearing Orange Shirt Day, and it was meant to honor the Indigenous children that had been colonialized by white settlers and had been brought to residential schools, cultural community, their food, their way of life were all given up and forced to wear white people's culture and assimilate their language. Their history was completely taken from them. So we're intentionally noticing this as part of our history today, our past, present. And also Araceli wanted to give some trigger warnings. Thank you, Brian. So I did want to provide some trigger warnings because we are going to be talking about some domestic violence and sexual violence content that may trigger an individual, may provide some flashbacks about a person's experience with systematic barriers. Those who are marginalized experience these barriers. Also, systems of oppression are also put onto survivors to navigate. So we wanted to notify you there's potential for trigger warnings. Feel free to take care of yourselves. This will be on our Facebook page. So if you've missed some portion of the presentation, you can rewatch it later without any problem. So what do we do at Deaf Hope? So Deaf Hope was founded in 2000, wanting to provide services to deaf survivors who are experiencing domestic violence and as well as sexual violence. And our services are provided to survivors who experience domestic violence and sexual violence, and those who are also experiencing stalking, family violence, those who are experiencing violence from in the home, from other individuals they might live with, like for example, a roommate, deaf, queer, LGBTQ survivors, youth, elders. So providing support to those who experience also human trafficking. We're providing support for those individuals as well. We are based here in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. Our services are regional, as well as we do provide them at a national level. So if you don't have any cultural specific domestic violence, sexual violence, accessible services, Deaf Hope can cover individuals in need. We don't have our own shelter for people who are homeless or potentially need another place to live. So we do partner with other hearing organizations that do provide sheltering for our deaf individual safety. We provide training to deaf organizations to become more familiar and cognizant on how to support a deaf survivor, as well as agencies who are familiar with how to provide services in domestic violence and sexual violence, but maybe not necessarily to the deaf individual. and creating a safe environment for deaf survivors within their services. Deaf Hope believes that there's power and hierarchy in our community. And so what we want to do is the leadership, we are called a collective style leadership, which means that we don't have a specific hierarchy within our organization. We have 3 empowerment directors. It's an example of healthy collaboration and what that should like within the community. We try to model what we would like to see in the community. And I'm proud to be able to demonstrate that and show what we need to do and how we need to analyze our own biases and how we have internalized these biases and what work we need to do on a daily basis to better ourselves. So the purpose of DVAM, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, is to collaborate on a project. And we're wanting to continue the conversation about domestic violence and increase awareness within the deaf community. We're constantly learning new things, how to provide support to survivors, how to create healthier communities. Also, we're wanting to reframe what is the definition of domestic violence. Many people in the community think that domestic violence is just a single person issue, but really it's an epidemic with the society. Domestic violence has other linkages to other forms of violence. We want to review some traditional DV services and see if those identify and match with the deaf community. Traditional services don't always work. So we're wanting to share information about trauma-informed advocacy work when working with survivors and what that might look like. And why it's so important to have culturally responsive services for our communities. And what does that look like? What shape does that take? So Brian and I will be reviewing all of those and hopefully helps this spread throughout the community. Earlier, you had mentioned about working together in collaboration. Deaf Hope has very blessed to have the opportunity to work with 4 other agencies and programs all over the United States. Deaf Safe in Northern California, Deaf Share in Austin, Texas, Ignite in Rochester, New York, and Think Self, which is in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. So all 5 of these different agencies have worked together for this specific month to provide a series of videos. Some of them are live, for example, like today, and others have been previously recorded and will be posted on social media. So they are shareable. This is our way to help our community and reclaim a safe space. And the important thing is to have a dialogue about this. What's happening in our community? What are different ways that we can collectively support each other and different ways to increase people's understanding and awareness? Some people say, oh, yes, domestic violence is the same, doesn't matter where you are. Well, I think those who've been in the field feel like every week we learn something new. And with all this learning, we'd like to bring it to you and share it with the community and really open up and have an opportunity for you to ask us questions, share what you know. That's important as well for us. It makes the community that much more powerful and how we can create cultural collectiveness within our world. So for this month, each week, we will have these series of events. This week will be an introduction to domestic violence. And a little bit of what we're talking about today is providing some of the history and what that looks like in the United States, which groups tend to be more marginalized, and also talking about reframing different ways of thinking about domestic violence, things that might surprise you, things you may have never seen before. Then we will have more of an intensive conversation and have it be survivor centered. And what does that mean to have the conversation be survivor centered? And how that potentially could affect our relationship in working with survivors and making sure their needs are met. Week 2 is going to be hosted by Ignite. The advocates will present on a topic called A Conversation to Better Serve Survivors Who Are Immigrants and Who Are Refugees. Those that maybe have experienced violence in their home country and have moved here to the United States. So that's week 2. Week 3's title is Safety Planning, and that's going to be hosted by Think Self. Week 4 is How Can We Be More Survivor-Centered? And that is, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. If I could back up a second. Week 3 is actually hosted by Deaf Safe. And week 4, Survivor-Centered, How Can We Be More Survivor-Centered? Is hosted by Think Self. And week 5 is going to be our way to sort of wrap up the month of domestic violence awareness. And we'll be doing this by having a candlelight vigil. And that'll be hosted by Deaf Share. So we have a very full month ahead of us, but lots of exciting things that are offered to you. So we'll talk a little bit about facts and statistics around domestic violence in the United States. So I'm going to share my screen. You will see some statistics on the screen. I will pause, have you a chance to review them, sign them in ASL. Those on Zoom, you'll have a chance to reposition your screen to get the appropriate sizing so you can see both the PowerPoint and see me as well. So if I could show this, nearly 1 in 5 women experience severe physical abuse from an intimate partner in their lifetime. That's for women, 1 out of 5. For men, the numbers are 1 in 7. These next statistics have to do with sexual violence. Roughly, 1 out of 5 women experience sexual violence by an intimate partner, which would be someone they're dating or in a relationship. Maybe they're married or they're a spouse with. So for women, it's 1 out of 5 experience sexual violence. The same researchers looked at the male population, and that's 1 in 12 men experience sexual violence from an intimate partner. These numbers have to do with stalking. About 10% of women have reported an experience of being stalked. And this is usually from in the reporting from an intimate partner. Of men, it's less than 2% have experienced stalking. So you can see these numbers. Stalking is very high in the United States. We're talking millions of people have experienced stalking in their lifetime. And where you're familiar with the increase in the use of technology, there are different ways that a person might experience stalking. That actually it's become easier because of technology. They're able to look at information through their phone, through the computer, at work, at home. There are multiple ways that a person can track an individual. Other technologies, homing devices, GPS trackers that might be placed on a car or in their personal belongings, that person may be unaware that it was placed there, but it will identify where that person is going. These are statistics related with youth. These are those who are under the age of 18. For women, 26% of women have experienced intimate partner dating violence before the age of 18. 26%, that's more than a quarter. That's quite high. And for men, the number is a little bit lower, but still significant. 15% happens before the age of 18. And so I think we have to think about how are we become so used to violence in our daily life, from children aged up to our teen years, to young adulthood, into our adulthoods. We've normalized violence through these years, and that's something we need to address. Domestic violence does have a financial impact. The cost associated is $8.3 billion annually, affecting people in the United States. People think 8.3 billion, that's impossible. But in fact, if you count the total number of costs associated with injury, medical bills, hospital stays, therapy, counseling, and costs of having to miss work, if you total all that up, that is more than 8 million. And the last statistics that I'll tell you before I turn it over to Arcelia, you may think that those numbers have to do with the general population. Most percentage, those are hearing statistics, but what about the deaf community? Unfortunately, there has yet to be a lot of information about the deaf community over the last couple of years. One study happened in 2011. It indicated that for the hearing population, about 25% of women experienced domestic violence, and in the deaf community, the numbers were more close to 50%, much higher. Reason being, because the deaf survivors experience more barriers to assistance. Those barriers create more levels of lethality that get tacked onto the person's experience. There was another study done in the same year for college students. They found that students experience physical and sexual violence. The number was higher than their hearing peers. It just shows that it's really significant in the deaf community, and we need more resources, more financial support. So that's where we're standing right now as a community. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Arcelia.
Hi there, this is Arcelia. I just wanted to tell you now about domestic violence and what that actually means. I think it's important for us to remember that domestic violence does have 3 parts to it, and we can remember them with 3 P's. 3 words that start with P. The first one being power. Is there a power differential, or is there equal power? The second P being about whether the violence happens once or if it's recurring. And the third one is about whether the person is someone that with whom you have a special relationship or not. And if all three are present, then you do have domestic violence occurring. And I've noticed that some people will say, oh my gosh, I saw such a terrible episode of domestic violence. And I want to ask you, as our audience today, what the difference is between domestic violence and just an unhealthy relationship. How would you be able to tell the difference between the two? I would love to hear from you. And I'll just start telling you what I think. One way to be able to tell is that for unhealthy relationship, look at the power part of the equation. If someone is angry and is fighting with a partner, and the partner is experiencing a lot of fear and feels like they can't speak up for themselves, then that's one thing. But if the partner feels like they do have power, they don't have fear, there isn't a power differential, they feel like they can express how they feel, then that's just an unhealthy relationship and not domestic violence. It's yeah, there are unhealthy traits, but domestic violence, there's always a very palpable difference in power between the two. And it's possible that different partners have different agreements in their relationships. Perhaps they've agreed that one person takes over the finances while the other one is responsible for chores or things like that. And as long as there's an agreement between the two in terms of dividing responsibility, that's fine. But when there's a power differential and there's control and fear involved, and there are threats of death involved, that's where it becomes domestic violence. Domestic violence and sexual violence are represented on something called a power and control wheel, which has 8 different sections to it, 8 different sections on the wheel. And they're different, it shows different techniques and strategies that the person who's causing harm does to assert power and control. And I'll be touching on those different parts now, just to give you some examples. But the whole wheel shows how people gain more control over their partners. So some examples of things that you will find on this power and control wheel are things like coercion and threats. And I see that a lot in our community. I'll see a deaf mother who may be an immigrant from South America. Their partner may threaten calling ICE and deportation, and the person who's causing the harm is a US citizen. So there's already a very clear power differential, and that person who causes harm uses that to hurt their partner and scare maybe that person even to thinking that their children may be removed. In the deaf community, sometimes a person will also use their reputation. If they have a good reputation in the community, they'll use their position in the community to say that their partner's story isn't true and threaten gossip and tarnishing their partner's name as a way to gain power. Sometimes when someone in a family experiences domestic violence, a person will say, oh, well, you can't leave me because your children are deaf and they need to stay at the residential school here, and there aren't very many available. So that's another way of exerting control and using coercion. Then there's emotional abuse. As you know and may have seen, sometimes deaf survivors learn sign language later in life. They may have grown up being mainstreamed and they join the deaf community later in life. And the person who causes harm may have grown up in the deaf community and may be quite fluent and have a lot of networks in the deaf community. And so they will insult their partner by saying that they're not deaf enough and that they will be left in the cold if they don't stay with that partner with them. And that person may feel that they're not welcome, and that may make them stay. And so then they need to rely on that person to access the deaf community or feel like they do. And they stay locked in that way. They feel like that's their only avenue into the deaf community. And then another example is within the economic realm, economic abuse. The person who causes harm may be hearing or be very bilingual and be quite fluent in English and may ask the welfare worker to put their name as primary on their account and other accounts, and they may sign up to be power of attorney or POA, and that gives them incredible control. They have rights of all the survivors' decisions. The court will recognize them as the person who makes decisions and who understands about the partner. They may tell the court that their partner doesn't know English well enough to be able to understand what they're saying, so the court will rely on them to give information. And then for debit cards, they can track those to keep track of them. And today with technology, we're able to track very well. In fact, there's something called spoofing, where you're able to download all different types of apps and have them running so that you can act like another person. You can assume their identity. And so if the person causing harm is technically savvy, they can install these apps on their partner's phone and control them from their own phone, and that their partner may not have no idea. So these are just a few examples of things that we have seen, different strategies of power and control that people have used. And these are unhealthy relationships. These are very intentional behaviors. Some people think that when there's domestic violence, that the person causing harm must have individual issues or anger management issues, but often that is not the case. Domestic violence is really about power and control, and that's a systemic issue. And it's often from institutions, state agencies, and it trickles down into society. It happens where there are groups of people that are not equal to others. So domestic violence is a societal issue, not an individual one. Anything you'd like to add, Brian? And Brian saying, yeah, sometimes I'll see situations where people think that domestic violence is only physical, and often they'll sign the word abuse for domestic violence. But it's not only that. There's a lot of psychological and emotional factors involved where you try to really intimidate and lessen the self-esteem of the other person. It's not just physical. A lot of people assume that people who cause harm, I mean, you may have a specific picture in your mind of what that person is like. And sometimes people who cause harm may not match that picture you have in your head of what they're like. It can be someone who's not big and strong, who has anger management issues. It can be someone who's very even-keeled, who's small in stature, but who still has this way of intimidating and hurting people through power and control, through threats, financial control, and all these different things that you just mentioned on the power and control wheel. So it may look different than you think. And I just want to say that this webinar and this topic, the lion in the zoo that we're discussing, domestic violence is a much larger issue than you think. A lion looks like they're very scary and the king of the forest. They're like have the most control. They can be scary and bite you. And the problem is that you then think that it's an individual issue, that they don't have emotional skills or empathy. And so the solutions tend to be for that individual to get help, like counseling. Or sometimes the solution is to call the police and have that person be incarcerated. So you think with the person incarcerated or the lion in the zoo that we're all safe, but that's not the case. The reason being, the problem is not the lion, actually. It's not an individual. It's not, that's just a part of the system. It's really the whole zoo that's the problem, or the whole system. There are so many cages. For example, white supremacy or racial injustice, autism, sexism, homophobia, uh, ageism, classism, so many different ones, different kinds of violence. And that's what causes domestic violence. It's where you have power differentials in a system. And domestic violence isn't new. It didn't start yesterday. It's been embedded in our society for many years. So it's important to look at the bigger picture and see that it's actually not the lion, but the whole zoo, and the issue of power differentials, and that this is something that is connected through the whole, in all of us, through the whole system. So I think that's where we can start to address issues differently, is by seeing it as not an individual issue, but a societal issue. Look at the whole culture, society, and make changes at that level. And that would mean starting with young children and families and workplaces, starting with the media and other systems where we interact with others. And we can start with our own communities, and that's where we can finally address the core issues. And Brian's saying, I was planning to share my screen, but instead I will just briefly explain a little bit about some of the history involved with domestic violence in this movement. I really I feel like we have to thank the feminism movement in the late 60s for doing their work and helping with this power differential that we have in our society between different groups. And they did it between groups of gender. Feminists in the late 60s knew that society was not equal, that there was a huge disparity between men and women. And so they started a movement to help with this, and it was led by white cisgender females. And the work they did to break this glass ceiling that they were experiencing was significant. And at the same time, I do think we have to ask ourselves, who got forgotten in that? Who was marginalized? And I would say it was women of color, women who identified as queer, LGBTQIA, women with disabilities, and deaf women. Their issues and needs were not part of the original and mainstream fight to change the system. They were tacked on later. And if you look at the laws that were passed and who benefited most from those, it was white, cisgender, hearing, straight women. Some lesbian women, but again, mostly white. And we are opening that up to other populations, but we still have a long way to go. And now a lot of our current funding comes from VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, that act, and that was passed in 1994. And what that did was it funneled money to different services, advocating organization. Basically, it was a huge push to be able to use the police system and prisons, basically the criminal justice system, to be a solution to violence. But as years went on, they realized that the people who benefited most from this was a small number of people, and a lot of people did not benefit. So they amended the act to protect more populations, add more services like legal assistance for survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence, more support for those who experience dating violence. And about 5 years later, in 2005, they did add support for people who were immigrants. And they also added some federal funding for a rape crisis center and for survivors with disabilities. And since 2005, that act has kind of been on and off depending on who's in the government at that time. And they're depending on what's happening politically. And last year it was disbanded again, then set up again. And we're realizing that we really need that support for our programs. We don't fully rely on only that program. We have other programs that we use more, where we get more local support from the community and from the state. But because of VAWA passing in '94, other states passed about 600 different laws to protect survivors of different identities. And again, it doesn't mean we are all done with our work. We do still have a long way to go. Okay, Leah.
So I wanted to discuss about traditional typical services. What Brian had just mentioned about domestic violence movement and how it got started was from white women. So a lot of those initial first DV services, you're still seeing those happen today. But you see these services provided for different types of survivors. So for example, when domestic violence survivor leaves a situation, they need an advocate, maybe there's a concerned community member, they discuss safety planning with the survivor. One example of traditional DV services would typically be call the police. But if the survivor is done by a person of color, police isn't automatically the best option for queer, by a person of color, people who are outside the white cisgender box. Anybody else that doesn't fit in that box, police typically wouldn't be the best fit. But in traditional services, that is their first response. So for safety planning, it's not a one size fits all at all, ever. You have to put some more consideration into the survivor, their trauma, their past history, their experience with the police, their experience with the system, has been their experience with their upbringing and throughout their childhood. Putting all of those different pieces into their safety planning and involving different portions of the community will help the survivor be more successful. Sometimes we're brainwashed and we think police might help us, but in reality, sometimes that's true, but sometimes police will cause additional harm and heighten the DV experience. When traditional services tend to overlook cultural sensitivity, cultural responsive types of services to help that process for the survivor. To give you an example, some traditional services might require an advocate to be mandated reporters. So sometimes the survivor there's maybe violence with the children, they're responsible to report that to CPS. That can be harmful because they know the system is full of gaps. So CPS might help the survivor meet them where they're at, but quite often might not. First of all, having access to interpreters, they don't provide it. So, how can a survivor get full, transparent communication about what's going on and to make a fully informed decision without having access? It isn't possible. And we've noticed with having a police presence, they might arrest the person who caused harm. But you have to remember in the back, survivors do love their partners, even though they're the person that have caused violence. So sometimes they want them back in their family and they're trying to figure out a way. And in traditional services, their belief is to automatically cut ties and put that person in jail. So you have to be considerate with how we can um, overlap and cause more additional harm throughout this process. And we have to keep in the back of our minds those who have caused harms at one point in their life have been harmed themselves. So that's something that we have to remember to make sure that our services are responsive to the person's individual needs and not just following traditional means. Brian? I do want to add, I think that was a beautiful foundation to traditional versus non-typical services. And this is true for deaf survivors. With Aracelia's work and my work as well, providing direct service to survivors. Typically, those who've experienced abuse, or they're thinking, I have to get out right now. I have to go. I have to pack and get all my stuff and leave. But sometimes with leaving, seems like not a viable option to that survivor. They know in their mind that they should leave, but if they leave, they know that person might kill them or hurt them farther, hurt their family. Will notify my employer. I might lose my job. Might notify the system. I might lose my children. Report me to the authorities. Maybe send me back to my country of origin. Put me in jail. So the survivor thinks about all of these other options. And if I leave, the only person who is going to understand me might be my partner. Who else am I going to communicate with? And if I leave, where would I go? If I go to a shelter, is that an option for me? Everybody else is hearing. Do they understand a deaf person's needs? Do they know about my identity as a deaf person or that I'm a queer individual? I'm a Black woman. I'm a deaf person with an additional disability. Are they going to give me the assistance that I need? Maybe I'm diabetic and that I give myself insulin. Are they going to allow me to come into the shelter to take care of myself? Am I going to be able to self-medicate, for example, with insulin? Or are they going to force me to hand over my medication and force me to adhere to a specific schedule? All of these different thoughts go through with the idea of leaving, which is potentially worse. So the person who's experienced harm may actually stay and try to come up with a plan, defend themselves in some way, prepare for a safer option because they know that individual. But if they leave, there's that big unknown. If I leave, do I have to leave my deaf friends? Do I have to leave my family, my community? Do I have to uproot myself? That's scary. And so sometimes the traditional approach of going to a shelter or just going with your family, a lot of deaf people who experience impression from their family through their upbringing are born into hearing families. They may be the sole deaf person in their family. Maybe going to their family is not the best option for support. So the expectation of leaving, contacting your family, calling the police, you notice that a lot of hearing service providers follow this approach, but with deaf survivors, this isn't always the best option and it might not work. Yeah, if I could add one more thing. In traditional services, typically they provide the person to come into the office and they'll have them write notes, some sense of professionalism. But that's where we know that some survivors aren't able to come to the office. They might have transportation difficulties. So we change that and we meet them where they are, where they feel safe. Maybe coming into the office might risk their safety. So traditional and non-traditional services might veer and might benefit the survivor better. Or maybe they might think about this not being a professional situation, meeting them out in the community. But we leave it to the survivor. That's the goal of keeping the survivor center focus, making it survivor centric. What does survivor centric mean? What does advocacy look like? And it's quite simple. The survivor leads us to where they need. We're just providing support and resources, different perspectives, different options, making sure they're safe. And in survivor-centered services, we talk with them, we support them. Maybe we work with their friends and their family to help them listen to the situation. Sometimes, we have that internal need to want to fix a situation just to help ourselves feel better. But to be honest, we need to listen to what they need. Maybe they just need you to listen. And so that's where we're there to offer. Can I share some advice? Do you just need me to listen? And the person says, no, I don't want your advice. I just need to get this off my chest. I just want to tell you. And that's a simple thing that we can do to keep services survivor centric, keeping them at the heart of the services, empower them. Because if they do ultimately leave their domestic violence relationship, they know what they want. They have it on the inside. And with the survivor centric approach helps them to get out of their shell and figure out what they need to do and to be able to advocate for themselves and make the best decision for themselves. It's about empowering the survivor. We don't look at this as a peer service provider relationship. We look at ourselves as peers with the survivor. And we are not the expert about their situation. The survivor is. I don't know their situation. I don't live their experience. I don't know best. They do. So that's where we honor their truth, their lived experience. They make the decisions. They know best. We might not know, but we find out. We have a heart-to-heart conversation with that survivor. Brian, did you want to add anything? Yes, I do, just briefly. As an advocate, we understand and know domestic violence. It's all about power and privilege. Depending on the context is how we might actually sign it, but maybe it's different privilege to me or to another person, but it's all about the relationship that you have with a survivor and recognizing my privilege as a cisgendered white man with education, with family support, with access to finances if I had an emergency. I have a partner who's supportive. So it's important to name it, identify it, and say, yeah, we could still work together. You might unintentionally oppress someone. It's okay to have them let us know that they're feeling uncomfortable in that situation and to keep that communication open and for us to recognize and apologize for it and learn from it. It makes us more equitable. It makes the relationship between us more favorable and more productive instead of me just telling them what they need. We become a team. So my availability, my resource, my knowledge, and my team, Arcelia is an expert and especially about housing. She's sort of the guru about housing. So I might go to her asking her for support. And so the Deaf Hope team really has the survivors back. So they don't feel alone. And there's no coercion towards a specific option that they have to choose. We know they might feel alone or hesitant, so we're available for them. We work with them to achieve their goals. We just hold the confidence that things can be better and that we're here to see new possibilities. We keep that at the forefront. We hold peace, we hold the relationships with their family, with whoever maybe they're dating next, with who their colleagues are, their friends. We help them get to that place. They might not see it at this present time, but we walk alongside them to guide them, to help them navigate this, to get to the best result. That's the power of survivor centric advocacy. So it's not just about focusing on DV survivors' present moment, but really the whole experience of that individual. You know, maybe we're you talking with that person like, oh, what's that? What are you eating? That looks good. I mean, food, we always talk about food. It's such a great connection. Art, jewelry, how that person, their earrings. Oh, do you like art? Great, me too. And making some more connectedness and just be real. Show up as a whole person. Having that information will help to support how you can provide advocacy and support to that individual. Yes, there maybe have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and they can't see beyond that right now. And maybe rent is the most important thing for them right now. That's again, survivor centric advocacy is, throwing out the traditional agenda and figuring out what's most pressing for them. And I would meet them where they're at. I think you've made beautiful points, Brian. In my work, I think transparency is so important to the survivor. If I'm in a meeting, what should I share? What do you not want me to share? We show them what healthy communication looks like, model that for them, and show that we care. We care about what they want. I think that that means a lot. Like you had said, walking with them. Transparency helps them feel like they're less isolated. And sometimes I say, these survivors, sometimes they are my teachers. I've learned from them. So I've taken what I've learned throughout the history from the survivor. So really it's a two-way street. So making sure they know that as well, that they have value. It's not just me, knowing everything about domestic violence. It's really a two-way street on how we can help each other. I love that. So I do want to take a brief break to check in with comments, clarifications, questions, and we will continue to cover more topics after this. But if we could pause for a minute and check in with questions and clarifications. Does anybody have any clarifying questions? I think I saw one earlier. Maybe we could answer that while other people are having thoughts, typing their questions, asking for points of clarification. And here's Mallory.
Hi, this is Mallory. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and I have a white wall behind me and a window. And I do have a question here. It's about gaslighting and whether that is part of the domestic violence definition or not. Araceli is saying, I'm looking for the question. And Brian saying, Mallory, if you could repeat that question. And Mallory saying, yes, one person was asking about gaslighting and if that is a symptom of domestic violence. And Brian saying, Aracelia, shall I answer or would you like to? Brian saying, I'll go ahead and answer. Basically, gaslighting is a technique where the person causing harm is intending to do that, and the person receiving harm doesn't know, like loses confidence because they don't know what their behavior is, because the person causing the harm is obfuscating what's happening and is taking advantage of that and using that to gain control. They put out their beliefs and wants and desires and ask their partner to trust them with their money, that they will take care of things for them. Or they may say that their partner is making things up, doesn't understand what's going on, and the partner may start to not trust themselves and trust their person who's causing harm more. And then the person who's causing harm takes advantage of that. That's gaslighting. It's a very psychological way of gaining control. And yes, that is a part of domestic violence. Araceli is saying at the beginning of a relationship, often a partner will say that that's not happening, but that they feel very confident. But that is actually another technique of gaslighting, that it's an incremental thing that happens over time. The person who's causing gaslighting is wanting their partner to become dependent on them, just like Brian just said. And so it's only over time that they start to doubt themselves. And Mallory saying, I have another question. This person is talking about traditional and not traditional services, and they're asking, in terms of survivors who are getting non-traditional services, but they're still, or maybe traditional services, but they're still in touch with the person who's causing harm, what would you say about that? And Araceli is saying, yes, I've experienced someone who is still in contact with the person who's causing them harm because they live together. And we recognize that sometimes the cost of living or other factors make it so that a survivor has to make that choice to continue living with the person who causes them harm. And we do not stop services at that time. We still guide them and provide resources and support. Because if we don't, then the harm will be even worse. And my belief is that it's our goal to minimize harm. We can't eradicate it always, but if we can even minimize it, we've met our goal. And if they want to continue living with the person with harm, then we want to be survivor-centric and help them where they're at. So that's requires us to sometimes be creative and think outside of the box. Mallory's saying, okay, I have another question here. If a person has experienced domestic violence in different relationships, this person is a survivor multiple times, does that mean it's the survivor's fault that they must have issues? And Brian's saying, I would love to hear your answer too, Araceli, but I'll start. I have seen a lot of victim blaming. Often survivors will be seen as people who have a pattern in dating people who cause harm. And it's important to remember that the statistics of all these issues are very high in this country. 1 out of 4 women will experience intimate partner violence. 1 out of 4, that's such a significant number. So it's not surprising that one person may experience it more than once with different relationships. In our culture, violence has become normal. We accept violence. It's part of our everyday lives now. So now it's a matter of how we address these issues. Sometimes once violence is addressed, it pops up somewhere else. So we need to look at the bigger picture and just remember that the chance of multiple experiences of domestic violence is actually high. If someone grew up with a family where the parents had a relationship where there was domestic violence, or there was some type of unhealthy relationship, that can be embedded in the child and start to feel normal for them. They may think that that's what a relationship looks like, and it becomes a part of them. So it's important for them to learn a new model, a healthier one. And that takes time, and it's not always easy. And they may just be on their journey and not there yet. And those conversations are not encouraged in our society. So yeah, sometimes violence begets more violence, and we need more parents teaching their children what healthy relationships look like, how to solve conflicts, how to have peaceful relationships, how to have partners not take advantage of each other. That's something that we usually learn in our families, not at school. So there are some people that learn unhealthy things as young people. So again, survivor-centered means we don't blame the victim. We focus on who caused the harm, why that happened, what the circumstances were around that, and look at their beliefs and how they treat other people, their self-view. I think it's important for us to focus on there and again, use a system perspective. And Araceli is saying, beautifully said. Wow, I completely agree. I just wanted to say that I think sometimes we look so hard at the problem that we don't see the bigger picture, and we need to have that bigger perspective. Sometimes we don't think about why the person causing harm is causing violence in the first place, or we don't talk about the power differential or the conflict. And these conversations are important to have. We focus so much on the survivor sometimes that it perpetuates violence in our communities. I also think that we need to keep in mind that yes, in our society, violence has become normal, but interactions using violence are really not normal at the same time. So that's again where I want to emphasize looking at the history of the person who causes harm. And hurt people. And if they don't heal those wounds, they will continue to perpetuate violence because that's all they know. I think that's where we need to invest our time and energy and resources, not always on the survivors, but also on the people who cause harm. Because if we do that, their goal of keeping people silent about domestic violence will be successful. So we need to shine light on that, and we need to have these conversations. We need to talk about conflict resolution at different stages of life and give people the tools to solve problems. And that will help society and different communities much more in the long run. Mallory, Brian's asking, do you have any more questions? Or maybe, yeah, we'll do one more and then move on and then have more at the end. Mallory's saying, how does somebody show proof of a restraining order against someone? Like if there's a deaf event, how do you show proof that you have a restraining order against someone when you're in the deaf community? Brian's saying, I have actually seen a situation like that, a huge deaf event where a survivor has a protective order or restraining order, an actual piece of paper, and they show up to the event, and then they see the person that used to cause them harm show up at the event as well, and they don't know what to do. And they have a restraining order against that person. And again, there isn't a one size fits all approach to this. There isn't one answer, but one possible solution is to talk to the person who's organizing the event and just talk about general safety for the participants. Maybe the person with the restraining order can ask the event planner for the person who caused harm to leave. And that person may oblige and ask that person who caused harm to leave so that the other person can feel safe and not name any names, protect the survivor's privacy, but just ask that person to leave for general safety. And I have seen that approach work for different situations. But again, it doesn't mean that it will work for all situations. It's a case-by-case analysis. And Araceli is saying, I remember there was a situation where someone had a restraining order and was in fear. And so there was a meeting with a few people, including the organizer, so that all were aware of the issue. And what happened was we developed a safety plan. So the person who caused harm was told that there were concerns and that they would be watched all weekend to make sure that there was no harm done by that person. So that person who caused harm was on alert. They knew they were being watched. And that way the survivor felt supported enough to be able to have a good time. So that's just another idea of a solution. And Mallory's saying, thank you very much. And Brian's saying, we'll have more questions at the end. We're absolutely thrilled to answer more if there are some. All right, so to continue our talk, we'll now talk about trauma-informed. Oh, I'm sorry. I know I look very yellow right now because of my lighting. Please excuse that. But what does trauma-informed mean? So basically, I have worked with many survivors, and I have ideas on strategies and approaches and safety plans. I have all these techniques. And if I throw them all at the survivor, if they're not ready, that doesn't really work. If they are ready, it's fine. But if they're not, they get frustrated. And I may get frustrated and wish that they would just listen to what I said because I am the professional and I know what I'm doing. And that's not trauma-informed. Trauma-informed means having empathy for the survivor's experience, for the sexual violence they experienced, for their emotional state, and also for feeling like they don't have the power and choices and confidence that they used to, that they're feeling vulnerable and they're taking this journey one day at a time to heal. And that pace and cadence and timeline is up to them. That it's up to their body, and they will know how quickly or slowly to take that journey. So it's really a focus on self-care. And they'll know from physical signals, from their thoughts and feelings, where they're at. And we are outside of their body. We can suggest things, but we can't really know what's going on with them. And so we shouldn't put our expectations on them. Instead, we should just use empathy. Really be with them on their journey and not like outside of that journey and above them, but with them, alongside them. And understand not just from the head, but from the heart as much as we can. That is what trauma-informed means. It means listening to where the survivor is at with empathy. And if I've told the survivor something 3 times, I can say it a 4th time. I don't have to give up after 3 times. I can just meet them where they're at. And maybe that person will be in a different place the next day. They'll be a day older and maybe a day wiser. They may have a different perspective, even in that short amount of time. Or they may have gone the other way, and I can't assume what their journey will look like. So it's about being aware with where they're at on their journey, and that it may be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And doing that without judgment or expectations. Taking their trauma into consideration. So having more patience, which isn't always easy, but it's so important to have that level of care and show it. Because if I were the survivor and I experienced domestic violence, I would want that from my friends and family and coworkers and advocates. I would want that level of depth and care. If I had to work with a lawyer or the whole criminal justice system or the hospital and the medical system. Or maybe I'm part of a church group or another community group. Trauma informed would mean that I know I won't be shamed or blamed by those in those systems, that I will be understood, that I may need things repeated, that I may not be ready to hear certain advice or ready for certain resources or solutions. And I would hope for them to be okay with that too. Because I'd still be on my journey, and trauma is affecting me and where I'm able to how much I'm able to accept things or be open to things. And I would want to know that if I didn't follow someone's agenda, that they'd stick with me. And that's so important in a relationship.
Yeah,
Arcelia, do you want to
Arcelia?
add anything? Go ahead, Leah.
Um, I think that a lot with being trauma informed and providing trauma informed advocacy is it takes a lot of time, and it's not personal. That's part of meeting the survivor where they are. Things are overwhelming, and that's fine. And so to help keep a distance from taking things personally, it's not about me, it's that they're in a crisis situation. And so, again, empathy and compassionate for the survivor. Yes, compassionate. Okay, so a survivor has experienced trauma. Now, if you can imagine placing them within a hearing agency and having to navigate that system, the fact that they have to hold a space for their trauma, for the experience, and then on top of that, fight for language access, communication access, their rights with different states' agencies, schools for the deaf. So there's a lot of gaps within the system and with the hearing service provision. One evident example that everybody knows is interpreting access. Even when I'm in crisis, I might want my preferred interpreter who I'm most comfortable with, but that person may say, nope, sorry, they're making the decision for me and they're going to provide their interpreter. And so now I have to adapt to the interpreter that was provided. And so, yes, access was provided, but is it the most ideal and optimal situation for me? It isn't. It wouldn't be. So interpreters might not be accessible. And also, if the agency may not provide culturally responsive services to the survivor, that could also be traumatic. So let's say if the person is BIPOC and let's say they assign Black Sign Language, then maybe they have a white interpreter in place. That wouldn't be effective. There'd be a lot of miscommunications that might actually do more harm to the survivor because of failure to communicate. So gaps, again, some areas are still performing traditional type services, DV, SV services. And to be honest, this is just not appropriate for the deaf community at times. And maybe it's out of ignorance or just they don't know. They're not intending to cause harm, but it does happen. And domestic violence and sexual violence agencies reach out to specific marginalized community, or do they just open their services up to everybody? They're not really thinking about the type of services that they might need. Do they have captions on their videos? Do they have a video phone? Do they have items for the interpreters ready? Do they have list of interpreter referral agencies? Do they have list of other services that could be referred to? Do they have other VRI agencies that might provide interpreting that way? To be honest, they're often not prepared. And again, in traditional services, a lot of those agencies are very professional. There's a standard intake approach, and maybe that approach isn't appropriate, or nor does it fit the survivor's needs. Maybe it's too rigid and they can't really fully disclose about the situation. So they're really only telling minimal details about what types of information they might have. and they're not feeling safe to explore the survivor's experience fully. And what's awful is that sometimes the advocacy says, oh, yeah, the system is going to help you, no problem. But the deaf advocates avoid the system as much as possible, with the understanding that, yes, the survivor may ask for the system to be involved, and that's fine. But again, we give some potential places for them to experience harm just based on what we've seen in our experience through our work. One big gap that we've seen time and time again is with shelter services. We know that deaf survivors typically experience more types of violence, and domestic violence, maybe specifically intimate partner violence. Maybe they've been abused by a family member, by a caregiver, by a whole variety of other folks that they may have relationships with. And the shelter may say, nope, sorry, can't help you. We only focus on intimate partner violence. That's a huge gap. How can these survivors receive help? How do they receive assistance with housing? So then they fall through the cracks very easily. Sometimes when child protective services are involved in a domestic violence situation, that's where a lot of power imbalances happen. Because CPS gets involved with deaf children with the hearing family, they may talk only directly to the hearing individuals and not talk to maybe the child, or just don't talk to the deaf parents. And with COVID-19, a lot of deaf parents who have children are maybe not getting home visits. They have to use Zoom. They have to make communication happen virtually. And children are suffering language deprivation. There's a loss of language between parents and children. And so that's causing great harm to the family, all done by the system. When we work with survivors of color, they often aren't a good match for traditional services. What we tend to do is fill in the gaps of those services. Maybe we take them out to eat, have a conversation in a comfortable environment, give them a space to open up. Because typically they're only restricted to 1 hour, but a deaf person often needs more than 1 hour just to explain their experience. Conceptually, the concept of courts, some survivors have experienced language deprivation. They don't understand the overarching concept of the judicial system and appearing in court. And so we have to modify our explanation maybe in 4 or 5 different ways with, repetitive nature to get the person to understand what the judicial system is. I mean, I may have to read a legal document 2 or 3 times myself to understand what is being asked or what is being implied. Home signs, trying to figure out what the target language is for the individual. And I don't always use strict ASL. Sometimes I have to gesture or find different ways to communicate. Sometimes I may say, food, come on, let's go. And use more gestures to help communicate with that individual, just depending on their language. Brian? Yeah, related to gaps in the system, I know that there's gaps with the LGBTQIA survivors. And I know that a lot of individuals don't trust the system because they've been oppressed, discriminated, rejected, marginalized. They're not making things equal for people who identify as queer, historically. They might contact someone for help, but in the back of their mind thinking, are they going to shame me? Are they going to oppress me? Is this organization faith-based? Are they going to reject me based on religious affiliation? So survivors have told us that if they're unhoused, they don't have a home, they might want to go to a safe house, but they are wondering, is it queer friendly? Are they going to understand me as a deaf person, my identity as a queer person, if I'm trans? Are they going to recognize my entity and my pronoun? Or are they going to make assumptions about what they see as my appearance? So there's lots of hesitation from the survivor, and understand that there's unique relationships that need to be made with, same-sex relationships with their partners, non-monogamous relationships. Maybe they're dating multiple people at the same time. Are they going to understand my preferences? Maybe I'm taking HIV medication. Are they going to allow me to continue to take that, or are they going to take that from me? So there's lots of questions that are put in the minds of queer survivors. If I'm a butch lesbian, but I'm a survivor, and person that caused harm to me is my partner, and maybe that partner is smaller and more petite, are they going to believe me? Because that might not fit the face of violence. So it depends on the different individuals' experience and how they're going to be able to receive services from those traditional communities. So we're going to wrap up with some final points of information. Araceli is going to talk a little bit about our call to action. And if we have time remaining, we'll go ahead and answer some of the remaining questions. So I hope that you've enjoyed our presentation today. Maybe not enjoy, but at least learn something from today. I think, again, it's important to understand that domestic violence, addressing the lion in the zoo, the lion who looks so fierce with big fangs and is dangerous. And if you put the lion in a cage, that you'll be fine. But again, the problem is not the lion. The problem is the zoo, or the system of oppression, of imbalance, of separation, of punishment, of limitations, not providing appropriate support. That's where domestic violence is the problem. Not understanding our culture, our family structure, our upbringing. It affects what we've seen through the media. It happens in city, states, on a national and global level. Everything that's happening in our world, how we address conflict, war, finding peace, all of that gets internalized. And domestic violence is part of all of that, and reframing it with that in mind. So this means that those who have experienced survivors, and to be honest, I think all of us are survivors. I think that none of us, it's not just that group over there. I think it's not just one specific place, or the abusers are over here and the survivors are over there. That is very antiquated thinking. So let's think as if we're all survivors. We all have different power and privilege, and all of us have either caused harm on purpose or by accident, or we supported or reinforced the system that caused harm. So what does that mean? We're all responsible for domestic violence, every single one of us. So the good news is that we can make a change. We can shift cultural, societal, systemic expectations together. You're right, Brian. I totally agree with you. Oftentimes, community members come up to me and ask what they can do and how they can be involved. So as a suggestion, your right to vote does have an impact on policies, services, financial streams to support these services. So go out and vote. So we'll go ahead and open up for comments, questions. Mallory, come on in. Mallory, we're going to drag you in. Come on in. Sorry, I was busy typing questions in the chat. I see that you're on top of it. Mallory says, first question, the stats that you showed earlier with big D deaf, little d deaf, hard of hearing, hearing individuals, hearing with deaf people, but it actually didn't show deaf with those who are members from other marginalized communities, maybe who aren't deaf. And so those statistics are mostly focusing on domestic violence, or are those focused on survivors who aren't causing harm? That's a good question. I did not actually do that much research. I am actually not the researcher. And so I know just the general answer to that, to be honest, really is that we don't have enough research. So the answer to that question is that these were done by initial studies, mostly done broadly to understand domestic violence and how that intersects with the deaf community. And that was the focus earlier. But your question is more breaking down into the smaller populations that live within the deaf community. And yes, we want to know that data. We hope that that data will become available, but to be honest, we don't have the funding to be able to do the extensive research and have the resources necessary. If you know of information that has been already published, different articles of research studies, please let us know. We would love to find out. Another question: does domestic violence cause PTSD? Aracelia says, yes, some survivors do experience some form of trauma, might be PTSD. I think in the survivor's experience of domestic violence, it is part of the journey, but also acknowledging when a survivor goes to receive mental health services, part of those mental health services process, they have to diagnose the individual of having PTSD. But if that person may not describe it themselves, but essentially it is trauma, it is attached to the individual's experience. Next question. Some states provide a domestic violence order. I would assume this would be similar to a restraining order. These states are not all standard, are they? I'm not aware of which states don't have a domestic violence order. I'm pretty sure that all states do. Brian says, yes, that's been my experience as well, working with survivors in different states. Aracelia, both and I have worked at the national level, both in California here as well as outside in the rest of the nation. And so far, I have yet to experience a state that does not have a domestic violence order or a restraining order. Another question. So if you can envision one case where the husband pushed his wife and the husband lit a candle or match and wanted to murder the wife.
Started a fire.
This actually didn't happen, but though we're imagining that if that woman left to get help, would that individual go to jail, or where is the line between going to jail and jail or helping the person who caused harm? So if the husband caused the wife before the system was involved, for example, yes, it is possible for us to help with that process. But in the scenario where the husband created a fire, that's a law that's been broken. And so I think that the system would already be involved. And so the police would have to come and take a police report, and those documentation become part of the system. And so that's a little bit out of our control. But if the survivor had come prior to want to maybe repair the relationship, I think that that's where we could do some brainstorming and some assistance. Brian says, yeah, I do want to mention they talked about putting that person in jail or some type of incarceration. Our society's response to violent crimes is, I mean, we could spend an entire day analyzing and discussing different viewpoints on the criminal justice system and incarceration, but it's having to do with interactions with the police and with incarceration. Actually, later this month, we'll be having conversation about more about this topic, and we'll let you guys know when we're going to be having a live webinar to address that. But to answer your question, incarceration does not always address the problem. Often it actually increases the frequency of violence or the experience of violence. They may experience violence in jail. They're actually, maybe they create more trauma. And then when they get released from jail, they're going back into society. They're having a hard time finding a housing, a job. They're unable to provide for their family now. So basically the only thing they know is just to do repetitive crime. So then it becomes sort of a revolving door in the criminal justice system. And again, that's not the answer. The answer we don't have sometimes. We know that going to jail is not the answer. Solving violence with more violence doesn't create peace. And so it's hard. Sometimes we support the going to the jail and sometimes we don't. It depends on the situation, but also it takes time. It takes community involvement. It takes brainstorming. It takes lots of trial and error. But again, being survivor centric, being trauma informed helps that survivor face the situation. So there's lots of different labels or ways to identify the situation. But knowing the one answer is not going to resolve all of the problems here forward. We don't really know that. But the important thing is that we shift focused, do investigation, find wisdom, and help us to influence our new practices. The goal for domestic violence, I think, as Aracelia mentioned, is basically stop it before it gets started.
And I wanted to add also that as a community, a lot of us have the same type of thinking where the person who caused harm should be excommunicated to an island. But the problem is that those people come from our community. So it doesn't make sense to excommunicate them like that, because eventually at some point they will return to our community. And that's where we need to really just actually invest in those people in the first place and not just get rid of them and make our community healthier that way. Mallory's asking if we have time for one more question. They're saying yes. This person is asking, what are your best tips and advice for a survivor who has to go to court and testify against their abuser? And Aracelia is saying, my tip is to have an advocate with them. There's a lot of work that can be done in preparation, like role playing. The advocate can act as the lawyer and role play the questions so that the person testifying has a chance to practice and become familiar with their answers. Because sometimes when someone takes the stand, the prosecution will pepper them with terrifying questions and they'll be off kilter. So this is a way for them to stay centered, be confident, and an advocate can help with that. I think that will help lessen their anxiety. And Brian saying, if I can add, the culture at court is not deaf friendly, is not like deaf culture at all. It's almost opposite. For example, someone will ask a short question and a deaf person should not give a long answer, or it's not culturally appropriate in terms of courts to give long answers. So that's something that can be practiced during the role play. And also explain just that hearing people, and especially court culture, it does not want a long answer. They don't want all the details. They don't want you to go off point at all. They want you to be as succinct and concise as possible. So just from a way, like from a cultural perspective, a way to practice that would be with an advocate and role playing. And for the person who causes harm, if they are present in court and they make some scary faces, you can also have the survivor practice with how they will deal with that. And the survivor's healing can't depend only on the court process. It can be in parallel, but it can't depend on it because you can't know what the court results will be. And sometimes they're not in the survivor's favor. And sometimes the survivor doesn't want to prosecute, but the state will do it anyway. So it's important to decouple the survivor's healing from the court procedures. Mallory saying, great, we're done with the questions. There are some comments. I don't know if there's time for some of those. They're saying yes. One person said that transportation can be an issue because a survivor may want to get services and talk with someone in person, but they may not want the abuser to know that they're getting services. That can be really difficult. Brian saying yes. Another person commented that statistically, for those who the statistics we have are just for incidents reported. So there are many that go unreported. So the actual numbers are much higher. Other
Right.
comments. Some of the statistics are flawed. They don't represent all populations. And often it's just white people who feel safe reporting in the first place, not marginalized populations. Trans and other survivors don't always feel safe reporting. So again, the statistics are not showing the full scope of the issue. All right, looks like we're at a close. Araceli is saying thank you all so much for joining us today. Looking forward to next week, Thursday, for our program then. I believe that's at 4 p.m. Brian saying yes, 4 p.m. Pacific time. So Mountain time will be 5, Central 6, and whoever's on the East Coast, it'll be at 7. And I want to recognize people who have made this happen. Arcelia, my team, my go-to for everything. She gives great support to survivors and all of us. And I also want to thank Amber so much, who's been with Deaf Hope since its inception and has been an incredible guide and valuable resource and support for us. And I'd also like to recognize Mallory Malskoon from Deaf Share. She helped us today with questions and answers and comments and with audience participation. And then our two interpreters, Leah and Cheryl. Thank them both so much for their voice interpretation today. And just so you know, this presentation will be provided and will be captioned. Sorry that was not, we were not able to provide live captions today, but we will have those available after today. Araceli is saying, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye, everyone.